None of this matters. Well, I guess all of it matters. Well, now that both of the cylinder jugs have been removed, and take a look inside the case, there's nothing really to note, and there's not a lot to see at this point. Nothing major going on in here. You can see all the way through. See on the other side? Put my hand back there. Hello. Yeah, so we're going to check a couple things before we move forward. We're going to get started on the crank end play first. I've got a dial indicator set up in less than ideal spot. Ideally, it would be mounted a little more rigidly than that, but that's all right. This will get us an idea. So that's what I'm getting, and what I'm checking is the movement of the crank fore and aft inside the case. Try and do this with one hand. There we go. So we got about 20.5 thousandths. And we look at our specs for crank end play. Should be between 2 and 14. We got about 20.5. So that's a little excessive, and I knew that coming into it, but I'm not going to tear apart the case and get that deep into it. The next thing I want to check before we move on to the bores is the side play on the rod on the crank pin right here. How much this moves side to side, which you can't even really see in the video there. So here's what the spec is. The spec is 5 to 16 thou. I'm just going to take a feeler gauge and let's see, this is here's a 10. Ten thou, just barely. Just barely slides in there. And I checked it with a 12. 12 won't fit, 11 won't. 11 kind of fits, but it's a little tight. So I'm going to call it 10. And I observed this pretty much the same on the opposite side. So we're in spec on that. They don't feel loose or janky. They actually feel really smooth. Watch this. There's still a film of oil in there. See how smoothly it drops? So there's a good running clearance. It's tight. I mean, I had good oil pressure, so I would assume that, you know, at least some of the bearing clearances were pretty good. But that's, you know, there hasn't been any pressure lube to that area of the rod in a while, and it's still nice and cushioned when it falls. So whatever tiny film of oil is in between the rod and the crank is enough to provide enough resistance that it moves nice and smooth. Same thing over here. Pretty. They don't bang down. They move real nice and smooth. I think the internals of the engine are pretty good. And, you know, that kind of confirms the 40 to 60 psi of oil pressure that I saw. So, I don't like that the crank's got that much end play, but we're going to live with it for now and see what happens. Here we are with the cylinder for the flywheel side of the engine. Here's the magneto mount right here. We're going to go ahead and pull the valves out, and then this will be about as far as we tear the engine down. I don't think we're going to go any deeper than this. We're not going to split the case. So I've got a valve spring compressor tool. Real simple. Just attach one side of the valve, one side to the spring. Rotate it in until you hear the springs pop, or you hear the keepers pop. And we're going to release. And if you've got the keepers off of the bottom of the valve, it should loosen up the spring. So, yeah, we got the keepers off of there. So now, you look inside. You can see that valve spring is sitting all the way on the floor of the cavity there. So, okay. So now we can pull the valve out, this side here, and you want to be kind of careful pulling them out. Sometimes the valve will have, if the engine's kind of worn, the valve stem will have some buildup on it. You don't want to score the guide as you pull the valve out. So just rotate it a little bit. And actually, the part of the valve stem steel's stuck to it. So this one's going to slide out real easy. Typically the intakes are fine because they don't get all of the hot exhaust gases going around them. So there's the intake valve. And here's where the keepers ride, right in there. Yep, doesn't look too bad. There's you can see the wear area right here where it actually moves in the guide. Doesn't look too bad. We'll set that to the side. And, oh, yeah, on these, I did the other cylinder first to try to get an idea of what, it's kind of a tight spot in there, so I did the other cylinder first to see. But on these studs that sit in the center, they kind of block your way of pulling the springs out of the chamber. Take a pair of vice grips. It doesn't take much to unseat them. And screw out the stud. This will help you swing the springs out of the chamber. You need to get them out. So there's the stud. And now we can take the spring up out of the chamber. Let's see. I used vice grips again for this to try to compress the spring a little bit. Let's see if I can get you. There you can see, yeah, maybe you can see right there. I'm going to try to compress the spring enough to get it out. Now the intake side is a little more difficult because you have the valve stem seal there. It tries to fight you when you're pulling it out. Alright, here's the... Comes out too. That's the valve spring retainer. And, here, let's get the clips out of there too so they don't go flying across the shop. So the clips are still down in there too. There's one. There's the other guy. And now that these are out of the, chamber, I'll show you what the whole assembly looks like. And you can see that buildup right there on the exhaust valve. There's a lot of like carboned up oil deposits all the way around that exhaust valve from where it had gotten hot and probably had crappy oil in it. So now we got the spring out. And here's so the retained, or the seal for the intake rides up on the guide right there. And you can see this is the seal right here. And it's actually split in half. So we'll pop that out of there. Yep, it's coming apart in two pieces. There's one half of the intake seal. And Oh, it's actually, it's in 3 pieces, I guess. There's the other part. And here's the third part of the seal. Should just be 1 piece. So, now that has been disassembled. That's the intake side. So we'll do the same thing for the exhaust. And before we do that, I'll show you how the whole assembly goes in, because the exhaust is pretty much the same. So you have sitting in the head, when the head's sitting like this right now. So you have your intake valve, and then on the intake you'll have a seal that rides along the stem, and then the spring, and then the retainer, and at the very top of the stem you have these retainers that have they have a groove in the center of them, and that groove rides right on this groove in the stem. So the way that this clamps down is like this. So what you're doing when you're using the tool is you're pulling this seat off of there like that so that the retainers can come off, and then they pop off like that, and then the spring is free to float further down and the valve can come out like that. That's basically how it works. Nothing special here. If you've ever torn into an engine, it's all pretty standard. So the exhaust valve has a rotator on it. It's a little bit different, but basically the same process. So let's pull that one out. So one side pushes against the stem or the valve, and the other side pushes against the spring. You set it down in there, you tighten it up against the valve, and if you listen carefully, you can hear when the spring is popped off of the retainers. That was it right there. So once it's free, you move a little bit further to get it completely up off of there. And retainers. Sometimes I don't know if I got enough room to pull them out while it's still in there. Probably not. This is a lot easier to do on a bench than it is when it's installed. So we got these guys here came out. So you want to keep all this stuff together. So I have a bag that I'm going to put everything on the intake for, and same thing for the exhaust, and then keep them separated by cylinder. If you're not going to replace any of the components, you want to keep the common wear items, the ones that have basically worn into each other. You want to keep them together. And it's just standard practice for anything in the Valvetrain. So now we're going to loosen it up, and the spring is coming back down into the chamber. And you take the tool off. Now the spring is completely pushed into the chamber, and you can slide the valve up out. Just be careful with it. Don't put it into a bind. See this? Yeah, this exhaust valve, let me give it a little bit of oil, has a little sticky spot right here where the carbon was built up. I don't want to chew up the guide when I pull it out, so I'm going to go real easy with it. Now, this particular portion of the valve has probably never really run in the guide, so that's why you got to be careful, because you don't want to score up the guide as you pull the valve out. Okay. And you can see that the exhaust valve has a lot more buildup in carbon on it from all of the hot exhaust gases coming by. So that's out of there. Now we got to get the rotator up out of there. Find it handy to have these needle nose vice grips to get into this chamber, because you really can't get your hands in there very much to try to get this stuff out. So this one, so on the exhaust valve there's a different retainer that has on a swivel, so the valve can rotate. Wow. This spring is actually kind of stuck in there right now from all of that carbon. Rotate it around a little bit, see if I can get it. Jeez. Yeah. That's pretty bad. And now, so there's the exhaust valve. That's where all the carbon buildup is. Right near the guide. There's a lot of buildup right here. So this side's definitely gotten pretty hot. And that's it. So here's a look inside of the valve chamber. See all of that buildup? That's the exhaust valve side. Intake valve side's a little cleaner. It's not as bad. So before we reassemble, obviously, we're going to clean everything. And then we'll go ahead and lap in the seats. Make sure they're nice and clean. So now that the valves are out, we'll measure these bores on the bench so you can get an idea of how that works. So let's take a look at the cylinder bore for the the flywheel side of the engine. So here's the piston that came out. And this is the thrust face here. This is where the wear is going to occur. And that corresponds with the bore like this. So the cylinder, the piston, as it moves up and down in the cylinder, will rock like this, slightly on the rod, because it's pivoting at the pin right here. So what we're going to do is check cylinder dimensions, perpendicular and in line at 90 degrees from each other. So we've got a mark here. So this will be the thrust side of the bore. And you can actually see the corresponding mark here. And then we're going to do a 90 degrees here to here on the opposite side of the piston, which would be this face in the bore. What we expect to see is a little bit more wear on the thrust face, which would be this side here. Tools would be a telescoping bore gauge, a 3 to 4 mic, and that's about it. It's there's not a lot to it. Don't try using these. You're looking for, a couple thousandths of difference between a bore that can be used and one that can't. So we're going to check it in 3 different depths. This is the sheet that I showed before. We're going to check at the top, the middle, and the bottom. And then we're going to check the 2 directions. One is 90 degrees from the other. So take your gauge, and they're spring-loaded plungers. Make sure they move freely. I lubed this one up with a little bit of oil before I started. And they're spring-loaded, so you can just set it into the bore. But you can't just set it into the bore and then tighten the screw and pull it out, because you can't be absolutely certain that your gauge is sitting perpendicular to the cylinder. So what you do is you rock the gauge, you set it in at an angle like this, and once you've got it sitting in there at an angle, you tighten the adjustment knob just a little bit. And what you're looking for is to keep even pressure against the cylinder as you slowly rotate the gauge. And it takes a little bit of feel to do right. You're slowly rotating the gauge until it slides out. Then you tighten it down. What you're getting when you do that is you're starting with the gauge more open when you're sitting not perpendicular, the gauge is actually reading much larger than the bore is, and you're rotating into a spot where the gauge can read the smallest dimension that you've got. So then you take your mic and you measure what you get on your gauge. And again, this is a lot of, doing things by feel, and in my experience, the best way to do it is really to take a couple different measurements. Each time you make one measurement, take a second one. And whatever measurement you get is what your actual bore dimension is here. So you do it in that direction. And I did that one while I was trying to watch the camera, so I'm going to do it again because I realized it was out of spec from my original measurement. It really takes 2 hands and a little bit of finesse to get it right. It's a little bit tricky. And you'll feel the gauge just finally break free of the bore, and that's when you know you've got your smallest dimension that you can get on your reading. Okay. So what we've got here is, and you can see there's just a little bit of drag to it. We have 3.125, and if you look here, you're at about 4/10,000. So 3.1254, and if you look here, that's what we came up with the first time. So you take a measurement in that direction, write it down, release the gauge, and do it again on the opposite side, 90 degrees apart. Oh boy, this is tricky. the main thing here is to utilize some patience and some finesse to make sure that you're getting accurate readings, because you can vary within, even if you vary within a thousandth or so, you're going to be giving yourself data that's just not right. All right, there we go. And again, we have just a hair over 125, and we're over it by about 4/10 thousandths. So that shows, and these are measurements taken on a completely different day, not on camera, so 3.1254. So it's good that we're getting something repeatable too, because there's environmental variables, really, we're going to be accurate within a couple 10,000ths of an inch. So you do your checks at the top of the bore, about a ½ inch down from the top, not even, right underneath the ridge, where the rings stop contacting the bore. You'll do a measurement there, and then a little bit deeper in the middle of the bore, and then down at the bottom. And if you look at the cylinder, you can actually see the very bottom of the cylinder. You can see on this side. There's the factory crosshatches is completely evident there. There's virtually no wear down there. So do the same thing for both cylinders. Record your measurements. And if you're trying to reuse a piston, which I'm not going to, but you can measure the piston as well. And if you measure the piston, you want to measure here to here on the thrust face here, where you can see the reason for that is you're trying to measure where the wear is. And if you look at the piston, you can see that really there's not much wear here, but as you get into the thrust face of the piston, from here to here you've got wear. And if you flip it to the other side, not so bad, but there's some wear there. So we know that this cylinder is in spec enough that I can take a hone to it, because the factory maximum wear for standard bore cylinder is 3 128 thousandths, and we're at 125.5 just about. So we look good there. If I was trying to reuse the piston, I would be measuring on the thrust face here, a little bit down from the bottom of it. Basically, you want to be perpendicular to the pin. And feels pretty close. We got about 300, about 3 1/15. So a new piston from the factory should measure 3 1/20 to 3 1/21. I'm getting about 3 1/15, which means that this piston is just about 5 thousandths smaller than it needs to be. The maximum that is in the manual that says you can possibly, or the minimum, I guess, because bore would be maximum and piston would be minimum. The minimum for a piston on an M18 is this value here for a used piston at 3 1/18. So even if the piston didn't look as chewed up at the top as this one does, it's really chewed up right there. Even if it didn't look like that, the wear down in here is still too much. And what's happening is, now that this is going out of spec, it's actually allowing the piston to rock even more, which creates more wear, and it's a spiraling effect. It just gets worse over time. But regardless, we know now that the bore is okay and the piston is not, which I had assumed anyway. So this will round up the inspection process. I've taken the valves from each cylinder and taken them over to a wire wheel and cleaned them up so we can inspect those visually. I've got them separated by cylinder, so this is the PTO side. This over here is the flywheel side. What you're looking for is any kind of excessive pitting on the seat down through here, any erosion in this area here. This is an exhaust valve. So if you have where this stem changes its diameter terribly right here, like if it was worn because of excessive heat, combustion pressure, or combustion temperature, especially on the exhaust, you can see that there's still, some discoloration in here. So you're checking that, also checking the width here to make sure that you have enough material left on the valve. And then also just rolling it on a bench, making sure that it's not bent or severely warped. Here's the intake for the PTO side after it's been cleaned up. After you clean it up, you can really see this face a lot better, and that's where you're really looking for pitting and spots where the valve wouldn't seal. I also went through and actually checked the diameter of the valve stem, because on the intakes, on both of the intakes for this engine, you can feel a tiny little ridge right here where it's worn a little bit. And one way to check for that without even doing a measurement is if you put the valve down into the guide and you try to rock it back and forth to see how much play you have in there. This really isn't too bad. It's probably a little bit out of spec. And in fact, I did measure this one. And so the specs I wrote down here for the intake valve and the exhaust valves. So your stem OD minimum for the intake is supposed to be 310 ish thousandths. This valve here, and I'll just show you the measurements for both of them. So on the, where are we at? We're on the PTO side. So this cylinder here, that valve that I just had in my hand measured 310 thousandths and 1/10 thousandth. So it's just a hair under the spec. And then the spec for the exhaust, the minimum diameter that an exhaust valve can be is over here. Sorry, I'm trying to hold two papers at once. 0.3088. So 308. Is that right? Am I reading it backwards? No, that's right. Okay. So if you look at the exhaust, we were at 309. So we did okay there. Down here, we had a little less wear on this intake valve for the other cylinder. We had a 310 and almost a half there, which puts us in spec. And then here we had a 309 and a half. So that cylinder is just worn a little bit less in general. But all of that stuff is kind of relative, you know. I mean, really, there's wear in the guides inside the head, where these guides are here. So, you know, there's going to be some wear in there. That's supposed to be reamed to 312.5 thousandths. So, it's probably not the right size anymore. And really, for the purposes of this build, if I was going to do a complete engine rebuild, new guides would be going in regardless. New valves will be going in regardless. But I'm going to cut corners. I got to cut corners somewhere. Otherwise, this will just spiral and I'll end up doing the entire engine, which I don't intend to do. Yeah. Cleaned up the valves for the other side. Do the same for the other cylinder. Inspect them for pitting or any burning that might happen. And when a valve burns, you'll see, you can actually see it. Instead of the valve being completely round on the end, there'll be a section of it that's just worn away so bad that it can't hold combustion pressure anymore. With the valve clearance being very, very minimal on the one exhaust valve, which would have been, let's see, which one was that? The one with the very small clearance would have been this one here. Or this, yeah, here's the exhaust. Would have been this valve, and would have been this cylinder. This would have been the valve if I expected it to burn. This would have been the one. And it doesn't seem to, still got plenty of material left on the valve. The seat in here looks just fine. I think there's plenty of life left in these guys, so. And then you want to inspect the actual valve seat area in here. Make sure there's no damage to the seat. Before we put it back together, we'll clean everything up, and when we put these valves back in, we'll lap them in. Just to make sure that seat's nice and clean. And as far as the rest of the valve train goes, it's, you know, springs and retainers and stuff like that don't really wear. You know, you're dealing with a low compression engine, not high RPM, low compression engine. So, you know, you can let some of this stuff ride and it'll be okay. It's not like it's tearing down a racetrack, you know, doing the 8th mile or anything like that. So, so those are the specs for the intake valves. I did a measurement for the pistons as well, even though I'm not going to do anything with them. If you look here, this is from the flywheel side. You have that piston, 3 and 115 and 3 and 103. And then down here, we had 3 and 117 and 3 and 103. So that's the top and bottom of the piston, although technically you're not really concerned with measuring the top of it. I was just curious because these pistons were so burnt on the top here, where they sit next to the exhaust port. It just melted. Basically, the aluminum just melts. So that second measurement is just for curiosity. None of this matters. Well, I guess all of it matters, but if you're looking at the bore, you know, we were taking measurements and trying to determine how much material was there. Really, and I didn't show this in great detail, but the main thing to look for first is just visually how much scoring is in that cylinder. No matter how perfectly round that bore is, if there's a decent gouge all the way down it, or there's a big chunk where some debris got in there and destroyed the surface, if that's got to be machined out, there's no sense in using a standard piston. It doesn't matter how round it is. If it's got a huge gouge in it or something, you're screwed. Here's the opposite side. You can actually see the parting line there where the crosshatch is almost perfectly factory crosshatch right here, where the cylinder's not real shiny. It's kind of still got that. Yeah, there you can kind of see it right there. You can see the line where the piston rings no longer touch the bore. So that kind of finish is what we're going to try to achieve when we go and put this back together. Overall, I think we've got a decent engine to work with here. The next steps are going to be taking care of the bores, honing them out, and cleaning up the combustion chambers, or cleaning up the valve pockets there, and cleaning up the valve box, because there's just a bunch of, especially on the exhaust side here, there's a bunch of buildup in there. And then we'll go ahead and we'll be honing the cylinder and lapping the valves in and putting new pistons in, and then we'll start reassembling.